Okay, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you might be on this planet. To speak to you, unfortunately, under these still rather constrained conditions, but at least we can all get together in the second best way. My name is Andre. I'm attached to the University of Stellenbosch Business School, and I will be spending some time speaking to you about Africa and in very generic terms, looking at the current situation in Africa, but more importantly, what needs to be done to bring about meaningful socio-economic progress on this continent. So, Ipek, if I'd ask you to just upload or get the slideshow going, then as you can hopefully see there, that gives you the topic. But more importantly, if we move to the next slide, you will see that what we want to achieve in these few minutes. So just press it one by one, please. So first of all, we'll have a look at just some facts and figures regarding Africa. Then I want to make the point very quickly that as important as growth is, it is not the same as development. What we're really looking for in Africa is meaningful, holistic human development. From there, I'll move on to a selection of six tipping points, things that we believe are going to have a major bearing on how various African countries unfold over the next few years. That enables us to come up with one or two scenarios, and then in conclusion, just for you to think about. So just one more press of the button, and we'll get the few generic thoughts. So, time is not our biggest friend. So let's go straight into a very short overview of Africa. And as I'm doing this, I must point out, of course, that Africa is a vast continent with 55 countries, and the features and the characteristics and the history and the culture, and the vegetation and the climate differ from country to country. So I'm afraid I am going to be talking very generic terms. Nonetheless, we see that from a pure economic point of view, you see in front of you is on the left hand side the total share of Africa in the world economy, less than 5%, if you add together North Africa and Africa. However, the continent's share of the world population is close to 18%. So, relative to the size of the population, we can see that economically, Africa punches below its weight. The next slide will show us that on a more potentially more positive note, there are three specific features of Africa's population. First of all, it is growing, and is growing faster than any other continent. Slowing down this growth, but still growing to such an extent that by 50, more than 2 billion people are expected to be living in Africa. In addition, Africa has the youngest population on this planet. As you can see there's a comparison according to three age groups between Africa and Western Europe. And in Western Europe, many of you know this, are concerned about this. The concern is that the economically active population is shrinking, and the aging population has exceeded the economically active population. Africa, nowhere near that. We have a fairly small proportion of people who are older than 60, and a very large proportion are still of working age. The third feature is Africa's population is moving, not so much from rural to urban areas, or more, sorry, not so much from country to country, but from rural to urban areas. And the numbers you see on the right hand graph are the urban population of Africa in 2010, some 400 million, and in about 40 years' time, 30 years' time, 1.1 billion. So a massive movement of people from rural to urban areas. The next slide, excuse me, shows us, if you just press the button again, that human development in Africa is improving, albeit of a rather low level. It is getting better. That's the good news. But if you add we see it still lags behind the rest of the world. So improving, but still quite some way to go before we even a medium level of human development. In addition, as the next slide will show us, we have a pleasing situation whereby we are expecting a quite significant increase in the middle income population of Africa. An increase between 2009 and 2030 of, as you can see there, round about 200 million. Unfortunately, alongside that, we have to point out that Africa, in terms of traditional definitions, remains and will become even more so the poorest continent on this planet. By 2030, an estimated 90% of the world's poor population will be living in Africa. Moving on to the next one. Um, Growth in Africa, and you see quite a long story there, has been volatile. And although at times it has reached for a couple of years between 5 and 6%, it really has not managed to stay at those kind of levels for more than just a few years. And the problem is that unless Africa is able to record 5 to 6% and even 7% consistently for a long period, it's going to be difficult to make major inroads into some of our major social problems. Why is growth often disappointing? Well, it's a well known story that virtually without exception, each country in Africa relies very heavily on producing one or more or one or two natural resources and not adding value to those resources, simply selling the raw material to countries elsewhere in the world. And they are the ones who then add value and create growth and create jobs. Just to confirm this point, if we move to the next slide, we will see that there's a very close link between the reliance on resources and economic growth. And the link is that the greater the reliance moving along the horizontal axis, the lower the growth recorded. It's often called the resource curse. On the right hand side just shows us how resource prices, as we know, as an added problem, tend to be rather volatile, at times moving upwards spectacularly, but then followed by an equally spectacular drop in prices, which means to some extent, perhaps to a large extent, many African countries and their growth depends upon the vagaries of international demand for and supply that raw material. Moving to the next slide, obviously, any conversation these days, sadly, about the state of any economy has to take into account COVID 19, the second severe global recession recorded in the last 2 decades. And we all know that in many countries, there's this ongoing trade off between taking steps to save lives, which means things such as constraints on people's movements and activity, versus the effect that those constraints have on livelihoods. And this is a terrible moral, economic, social choice that needs to be made. Be that as it may, if we look at the next slide, we see, and just press one more time, please, that last year, economic growth across the planet was, with virtually no exceptions, negative. China showed a bit of growth, one or two others as well, but we had a synchronized major global recession. The worst, certainly in living memory, and probably the worst since the Great Depression of the early 1920s, and even worse than the one we experienced about 12 years ago. However, although the emerging information and data is still very preliminary, if we press the button again, we will note, and once more, that for this year, there are expectations, maybe hopes, of a somewhat, in fact, a spectacularly better growth rate. Now, I think one has to be careful here. The figures for this year look very good and promising. We must remember that's coming off a very low base. And if we go to the next slide, and I'm quoting here The Economist of a couple of weeks ago, saying that we had a frightening slump last year, but now a weird and a fast and a furious and even exhilarating boom. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. It's still too early to say that we are out of the woods. there are some important fault lines that are emerging. For instance, and I wish I'd made this, I wish I discovered this term. You know, we often use in economics the haves versus the have nots. Now we're going to start talking about the jabbed versus the jab nots. So, in those countries where vaccination rollouts are quick and efficient, we're probably going to see a much quicker recovery in economic activity. In those countries where the rollout is slower and less efficient, we're probably going to see a much slower recovery. So, it's a recoveries. Meanwhile, ironically almost, while consumer and even business demand for goods and services is rising, because of COVID related restrictions, supply chains have become disrupted. So the demand is there. It's not always possible to meet that supply, that demand. And then a big question is when and to what extent governments all over the world are going to start tapering off on the COVID related stimuli they introduced last year in the form of much more government spending than usual and or in the form of an increase in interest rates. This year, for the first time in more than a decade, there are signs that inflation rates are increase in the so-called developed world, especially in the USA. It's been remarkably low for a decade, despite all the liquidity that's being created. As I said, there are signs of rising inflation, which will sooner or later prompt an increase in interest rates in the USA. And that will have all kinds of ripple effects, including putting pressure on emerging economies. That said, back to the major story, which is Africa, and we can skip this slide to save a bit of time. So let's just go on to the next one. You can just carry on. No, the other way, different direction. I want to argue that growth is not everything. Again, the opposite direction. Uh, no, forward. Forward, please, Epic. One more, but more and more. Just carry on pressing and carry on pressing and carry on and a bit more. There we are. Growth is important, but growth in its own right is simply a means towards an end. The mere fact that the economy is growing does by no stretch of the imagination guarantee that human beings and that all human beings will benefit accordingly. So I want to share with you, moving to the next slide, a kind of approach towards progress and development by stating on the left-hand side that what Africa really requires is a pathway that meets all the aspirations of human development. And various authors and analysts, including the one I'm about to show you, Dagi, have looked at development as the achievement of five classical aspirations. From top to bottom, the economic aspiration, the political aspiration, the scientific aspiration, the ethical aspiration, and then finally, the aesthetic aspiration. Let's take this a step further on the next slide. Those five, if you mind just pressing again, the economic aspiration is all about plenty. And press once more, please. The scientific aspiration is the quest for knowledge. It includes things such as education, political liberty. The moral, ethical aspiration is a sense of feeling good. And the aesthetic aspiration is a sense of beauty. Now, the problem is that each of these aspirations might be obstructed by a number of phenomena. Without going to all of these, the economic aspiration might be obstructed by the presence of poverty. The scientific aspiration might not be achieved because of illiteracy. The political aspiration, well, there might be a sense of autocracy. The moral aspiration might be obstructed if there's an overall spirit of normlessness in society. And the aesthetic aspiration is when it might be obstructed if people feel meaningless. There's no shared vision. They feel lonely. Now, where's all of this leading us to? The next slide will hopefully answer that question. is telling us, as an example, and we're looking here at an holistic approach. Society, for instance, cannot develop economically over the long term. It cannot grow at a high rate indefinitely if the quest for truth, sorry, just go back a step, if the quest for truth is not being achieved, or if is not being respected, or if the ethical aspiration or if ethical behavior is unacceptable, and if the respect for beauty is not there. So, what we are saying here is that human development, in the classical sense of the word, is partly about a growing economy, but it's more than just that. So, let's take this one step further by pointing out that all of this means, if you mind just pressing a few times, that when we look at any entity, a country in Africa, for instance, then it is influenced by, you know this, it's influenced by a wide range of what we could call external factors, the contextual environment, economics, technology, the social environment, etc. And all of those will have a bearing on our entity, our country. If we go a step further, by again pressing the button, then that's supposed to be a spider's web. I'm trying to implicate there the fact that all of those external environments influence each other as well. And we take it one step further by pressing once more and by reminding ourselves that we have to look at these things from a global perspective, from a continental perspective, and a national perspective, and even a smaller unit. So we operate in a world, and so does Africa, that is highly complex, where all these things interact with one another, backwards and forwards, sometimes in ways we can't always anticipate. And within all of that, we have to find and look for the pathways to progress that I'm trying to get at. So let's do that. By first of all going beyond that, we can skip this to save some time. You can just carry on pressing, and one more. There we are. So, with all that in mind, the question now is, what are the major, I'm calling them tipping points? What are the major factors, the major forces, the major unknowns, perhaps, that will tip Africa into either into downwards, into further stagnation, so the egg dropping off and smashing, or how could we, or what do we need to manage and look after to ensure that Africa uh, uh, puts itself on a higher, more prolonged developmental path? And I've come up with six. And again, I must stress they are generic. So there's the first one. Will we be able to compete in the global economy and doing so by diversifying? As I said earlier, we tend to over rely on one or two natural resources and we fail to add value. We need to add value to those resources and produce something that the world out there wants and produce it in an affordable fashion. Secondly, um, how are we going to deal with the democratic surplus? This might sound a bit odd, but it's about the story that many African countries have democratized. But unfortunately, the promises implied by democracy have not yet filtered through for everybody in the form of a better quality of life. That disequilibrium can become problematic. The next one is the whole question of social capital, that sense of belonging, that sense of cohesiveness, that sense of trust. It's about social cohesion. Will that stock of social capital get better or will it weaken in the years to come? Excuse me. The next one is, will we be able to properly and appropriately upskill our young population? I'll say more about that in a minute or two. But the next one is, will we generate or attract sufficient savings in Africa to finance things such as investment in infrastructure, investment in factories and machinery, and investment in human capital. And the last one, number 6, is will governments, if they have already become solid and accountable, will they retain that? And if they have, if they haven't, will they achieve that and maintain it? So accountable governance and the autonomy of democratic institutions will be a major tipping point. Now, if we move on a bit, I've done a bit of an exercise. I won't bore you with that, which we often use in future studies, which is also one of the things I do. And it turns out that whilst all of those are crucial, two are particularly crucial. The two I've highlighted there in red. We can call them pivotal levers. In other words, if those two can be successfully addressed and managed, it will help to a large extent to resolve the other four listed on this particular pie chart. So, what I want to do is spend the next few minutes zooming in and saying a little bit more about these two. So, first of all, the question of institutions. And you can just press a few times. If you get hold of the slides one day, you can read through this. The graph is more interesting. It's essentially telling us that institutions matter, and they matter a lot. Those institutions which are established to guide our behavior, to guide our interactions with one another. They help to span the gap between the private sector and the public sector. And if these institutions are strong, then lots of good things happen. If these institutions are weak and lack integrity, well, lots of bad things happen. What this graph is showing us, if you just mind pressing the button again, please. What this graph is showing us, and once more, is that there are no rich countries with poor institutions. And press it once more. By the same token, there are no poor countries with good institutions. So it's showing us empirically, if you like, that good institutions are also a good, almost indicator of the prosperity of a country. Moving on, I'm still talking about institutions. These just show us in different ways, you can press it again, that we find a good relationship between good institutions and things such as income distribution. So good institutions are often accompanied by a more even distribution of income, and the converse. The next slide is about the other one I highlighted. We have a youthful population, and this raises the prospects, the potential for something called a demographic dividend, which typically works in the way you see there, which I'll paraphrase. When you have a situation where the number of people of working age grows faster than the youngsters and the old people in that society, all kinds of good things can happen. Because this means the supply of labor is rising. In which case, and it is a very big if all these young people of working age can be employed productively, incomes increase, economic growth accelerates. And then as this continues, as we have more and more people working, earning a decent income, but they don't have too many dependents to look after, that means they can use some of their surplus earnings and allocate that to savings, which in turn can finance the right kind of capital we require, infrastructure and human capital. And this in turn further boosts average incomes and economic growth. So we will find, if we look back in history at countries we now regard as being rather successful, that sometime in the last century or so, they experienced this kind of situation. The population of working age growing rapidly, and they used this, or this became one of the co-creators of good and sustained economic growth. In fact, the next slide will, if you just press a few times, there we are, will show us. For instance, if we have a look at countries such as Germany and the UK and Japan and more recently the USA, when they experienced a demographic window of opportunity, they also experienced pretty good and impressive growth and development. Right now, look at the one third from the top. China's window of opportunity opened up in about 1990. Since then, the population there has aged rather rapidly, and the window of opportunity really recording wonderful growth will probably start closing in the next couple of years. The second from the top is India, excuse me, with a younger population than China and and getting bigger. They their window opened up about 6 years ago and could remain open until 2050. And right at the bottom, we have Africa, sub Saharan Africa. There you can see a much younger population, and this continent's window of opportunity actually only opens up fully in the year 2050, following the shutdown of India's window. Now, when I first did this last calculation, the others were done by somebody else. The last one I calculated, I was initially disappointed, saying, oh my goodness, 2050. That's 30 years down the road. We have to wait so long. But then on reflection, I realized maybe it's not such a bad thing. Because as I'm about to show you, it's all very well having a young population, but as that table shows you, we are still nowhere near at the kind of skills levels that are required to exploit this opportunity. Literacy levels in this subcontinent lower than anywhere in the world. Tertiary education enrollment has doubled since 1999, but it's still a woefully low 8%. So only 8% of all those people aged 19 to 24 in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, are enrolled at university or college. Compare that with any other part of the world. The world total is almost a third. In other parts, 70% plus. And this is reinforced by the next slide. Excuse me. In fact, let's move on again to the next one to save some time. Okay, we can stop there, which shows us on the right-hand side that a country like South Korea from 2000 to 2013, with a population of only 50 million, managed to register more than 200,000 patents. Nigeria, by contrast, with a population now probably approaching 200 million, registered only 19 in the entire period. That is indicative of what we could also call the. So let's take it one step further. By moving on, and just a quick reference to the fourth industrial revolution and the additional challenges that poses us, which we in Africa will have to master to become and remain relevant in the world of work. The one I find particularly interesting is the right-hand one, which shows us on the extreme right-hand column the kind of skills required in the previous three revolutions as well as the current one. If you just press one more time, it should circle revolution, or there we are. And interestingly, the really important talents identified for this fourth revolution, such as learning agility, being able to learn new things and learn them quickly and regularly. And then you also see adaptability, being able to adapt to sudden changes as quickly as possible. Empathy, and also transdisciplinary thinking. So this is what we need to aim for, amongst other things, in Africa to become relevant, to be able to exploit this demographic dividend. Right. So where's all of this leading us? I've just spoken about those two on the left-hand side in a bit more detail. The question of governance, the question of appropriate skilling, which, if correctly managed, will have a positive impact on the other four I showed you a bit earlier under the heading of tipping points. And if all of these come together, as it were, then that should make a major contribution to our broad definition of progress in Africa. So I'm going to use the two currently circled in blue, the two I've highlighted as pivotal levers, to share with you a very generic set of scenarios. So if you press the enter button once more, and again, there you see, okay, that's fine. Let's stop there for a minute. Along the horizontal axis, we have something to do with skills, the one pivotal lever. So we are saying here that, let's say in the year 2030, a country might have or still suffer from inappropriate skills, whereas on the extreme right hand side, the other polar outcome is a country having high tech skills, appropriate, competitive, high tech skills. And then the vertical axis, as you can see there, is the two polar extremes regarding governance and institutions. From at the bottom, institutional decay, to the other end of the extreme, renaissance. And these four quadrants give us four plausible scenarios. Plausible means it can happen. Doesn't mean to say that any one is likely or less likely or more likely, simply plausible. Let's have a look at the outlines of these four scenarios. So, we press enter. Let's stop there for a minute. Okay, that's fine. The bottom left hand side is where a country continues to over rely on one or two resources, and to add insult to injury, institutional decay sets in. That would be a typical resource curse kind of scenario. Let's look at the opposite, the top right hand corner. That is where a country has started to diversify. It has obviously done so by instilling the right kind of skills, and its institutions are healthy. That's the best of both worlds. African Renaissance. And that, by the way, is the African Renaissance statue. Then, in between, we have bottom right hand side. That is where a country has the right skills, but unfortunately, it is still suffering from poor and, let's say, almost corrupt institutions. So, almost there, but better luck next time. And then finally, the top left hand corner is where you have good institutions, but we're still playing catch up when it comes to skills. So, on the right track. Not perfect, not the worst place either. I'm not going to give you a long or even a short further description of each of these scenarios, but I think two of them. Let's look at the two extreme ones. So, on the next slide, you will see just some basic, if you like, characteristics of the resource curse scenario. Poor skills, poor institutions. Typically, you'd find here rent seeking behavior, where senior politicians and sometimes senior business people gather together behind closed doors and work out how they can exploit the economy for their own benefit at the expense of the broader population. Typically, property rights are hardly recognized. There could be an Africa Spring. I'm taking the cue here from the Arab Spring about a decade ago. In an African context, imagine millions and millions of younger people, frustrated, jobless, stuck in poverty, aware of what's going on elsewhere in the world, and looking for someone to blame. And they've got nothing to lose. They might as well take to the streets and rebel and blame whoever they feel like blaming, their neighbors, their governments, big business, small business, America, take your pick, China. The labor force probably still unhealthy. In some contexts, vigilantes or warlords might become the effective leaders. There's growth every now and again, but it's very elitist, and only accrues to a handful of people. Development stagnates. Now governments start panicking. Nothing's working for them. So they think to themselves, well, maybe if I just throw money at these problems, the problems will go away. But to throw money at the problems, they first have to borrow that money. Their government debt becomes totally uncontrollable. They end up having to resort to bailouts, either from the international financial institutions, such as the World Bank or the IMF, or China, or any other big sovereign nation. And you'll probably also start finding rapid increases in prices. That would be clearly the worst possible outcome. The best possible outcome, on the next slide, is what I called earlier Africa Renaissance. And some of the features of this can also be listed. Um, so we just press the enter button, please. We'll see, should see a list emerging. So this will be a situation where we have the right kind of skills and talents. The labor force is healthy. There's more tolerance and goodwill. Entrepreneurs are allowed to do what they could be doing. The space is allowed. And by the way, I think it's fair to say, with so many young people in Africa, I'm convinced there is latent entrepreneurship. Young people, lots of ideas, they just need the opportunity. There's more accountability. Everyone understands what we're aiming for in the long term. We do start industrializing using what we've got, resources. We become more competitive, and economic growth gathers pace, and is not just confined to a handful of people. Right. So, oh, yes, and development, of course, is then broad based in the way I defined it a bit earlier. So, as I slowly start wrapping up with a fairly lengthy conclusion, from all of this, I just want to really plant a seed in your midst, things to think about, such as these two I'm going to do jointly. Despite the major advances, obviously, in terms of technology and e commerce and e everything, brick and mortar still remains important. So it's a combination of brick and mortar and e commerce, so brick and click. And I've made the point already, resource based industrialization. There are more and more observers of what's happening in Africa who say, you know what, we'll never be able to produce things in factories, or at least not competitively. Other countries are past masters at doing that. We'll never be able to catch up with them. Let's not even think about it. Let's leapfrog from agriculture and mining straight into services. But no country's ever managed to do that. There has to be a natural progression. And we can learn from, well, the whole question of globalization. We can get inspiration from the huge success of many countries in Asia. And the idea is, as I say, to take what we've got and to convert it into something with more value. And it could be as simple, well, no, so let's be careful now. It sounds simple, it isn't, but it could be, an example could be converting raw diamonds into beautiful diamonds by cutting and polishing them at home and not just exporting the raw diamonds to somebody else. It could be converting phosphates into fertilizer, converting cattle into leather products, converting grapes into wine. Then, moving on, something else to think about is regionalism. I would almost say for the last few hundred years, but certainly the last number of decades, and I think I'm afraid it is still often the case, individual countries in Africa are economically very small, exceptionally small. Even the bigger ones are small compared to the rest of the world. And we all seem to want to do our own thing. And very rarely do we join forces. But this year, formally from early in January, for the first time ever, we have a situation where every country in Africa has signed an agreement, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, agreeing to phase out, amongst other things, import tariffs, thereby making it easier to trade with one another. It's early days yet. A lot could still go wrong, especially politically, but it's the first positive sign that the entire continent intends to join forces. Preliminary estimates show that if this thing does work, then by 2035, for instance, uh, the size of the whole African economy will be about $200 billion bigger than what it would have been. And trade between countries, at least 10% more than what it would have been. So we cross fingers and hold thumbs there. Next thing to think about on the next slide is, and I'm being very rude and nasty here against my own employer by implication, but I have to be honest that the curricula at most or many academic institutions, from school to are not really in alignment with the needs of the marketplace. That needs to be seriously addressed. Our education sectors need a revamp. Next one indicates that I've made the point already, entrepreneurs are crucial. We must stop paying lip service and saying we want more entrepreneurs. Let's make it happen. Let's make it easier. Let's make it affordable. Let's create the right environment for entrepreneurs to do what they probably could be doing very well. Then, almost finished, agriculture, we are grossly underutilizing our potential agricultural output in Africa. Up to 75%, 74% of all arable land is actually not being used or not being used very efficiently. There's so much we could offer in terms of agriculture. Then let's add to that on the next slide. So just press one more time. There we are. It's important that we realize there's no quick fix to these problems. Rome wasn't built in a day. As Lionel Messi said, it took me 17 years and a few days to become an overnight success. As difficult as it is to swallow, there's no magic wand that will transform a country in Africa to a hugely successful one within a couple of days, weeks, months, even years. We need to have a long term vision and plan. And then to add to that, I think it's important that we need to change our views of ourselves. When I say ourselves, I'm talking as an African, because far too often we see these problems or these challenges and we say, no ways, it's impossible. We'll never be able to do that. And that is half the problem. I know it's a bit of psychology 101, but if we all agree we can't do anything about it, well, then we'll probably will manage to achieve only mediocrity. Right? So the next one, still thinking about various things. Yeah, we can skip that. That's my other bit of one size does not fit all. I started off by saying that there are 55 countries, each with their own unique characteristics. It would be short sighted, irrational, and naive to assume that a solution for one problem can be used as is for any other country. Each country has to find its own particular way of approaching a problem. And then finally, the news, one more, the news we tend to see and read and hear about Africa tends to be, unfortunately, fairly negative. I think it's important that we ourselves should not only take note of, but also celebrate and publicize even any triumphs, even though they might be small ones, and any feel good stories. One such example is mobile money in Africa, which has really enabled almost overnight hundreds of millions of people to gain access to a bank account. Another example, if you can just move on, please, and then another one, move on again, is there's an example of red seaweeds in Tanzania, which are dried and exported for overseas production of a type of jelly, which is used by the global food industry. That's a wonderful example of adding value. Another one on the next slide is that gentleman uh, based in Nigeria. He started a business with $12. He now has a high end barbering shop or business in Lagos, in Nigeria. He flies in his own private jet to service his clients. That smart looking watch on the right hand side, if you just press one more, is made in Ghana. And then, almost finished, I see I've got about a minute to go. That is vaccinations of people against a variety of diseases. This is nothing to do with COVID. If we just press again, you will note that there's a very rapid upward trend in Africa regarding these programs, from lagging way behind to now catching up. And this is one of many examples, if you wouldn't mind pressing once more the button, of where we often get bogged down, get driven, our thoughts about the recent headlines, the news headlines, the spectacular headlines of this morning and last night and a week ago. It's important sometimes to take a step back and also look at the longer term picture, because very often the longer term picture gives you a slightly different and often more sanguine, more optimistic view of what's happening. So, to press one more time, and as you can see, that was it. And according to the clock on my computer, it is 13:46, which is as close I can get to 13:45. So for the time being, that is my quick story, trying to cover a gigantic topic and a gigantic continent in 45 minutes, but I've kind of done it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. I hope that this will stimulate some conversations within the coffee chats later today and that you have all enjoyed the session as much as I have. Thank you so much, Prof. You have a lovely day further.
Thank you. You're starting with the sick and tired of listening to me. Right. So, on that note,